The light was a single bulb swinging from the ceiling, making the shadows move even when no one did. They sat me on a metal chair and uncuffed my hands only to bind them to the backrest. The room smelled of wet wool and cigarettes, and something sweet that didn't belong there. Someone's cologne, maybe, or the ghost of a perfume that clung to a coat seized from another woman. They placed my papers on the table as if the truth could be flattened by a stamp. Name, the officer said, though he already had it written in front of him. I watched the tip of his pen, not his eyes. It was safer to study the small things. They revealed impatience sooner. A second man stood behind me, too close, his breath slow and regular. He wanted me to feel him there. Fear has a way of making a room feel smaller. Training had taught me to make it larger. Count bricks, trace the seams, measure the distance from door to chair with my eyes. 3 steps to the door, 2 to the table, 1 to the officer's wrist. They started with politeness. You're a sensible woman. Sensible women don't throw away their lives for strangers. I said nothing. Silence is not absence. It is labor. It is the work of holding every word in your mouth until it turns to stone. He tapped the papers. These names, I let my face slacken the way I'd practiced. Mild confusion, a touch of fatigue, the look of someone whose life is small and unimportant. It had saved me before. It would have to save me again. He tried kindness next. Tea was set down in front of me. Too sweet, too warm. We know you've been misled, he said, as if he were rescuing me from a dream. Say one name, and you go home. Home. The word hurt more than the rope around my wrists. I pictured a door I hadn't opened in years and a coat that still hung there for a winter that never came. I made my eyes drift toward the cup, then away, as if I were deciding whether to accept a favor. People like him watch for the smallest consent. A sip becomes a conversation. A conversation becomes a confession. I let the tea cool untouched. They moved to photographs. Rail tracks blown apart, a culvert blackened by smoke, a farmhouse window with the curtains drawn. He slid one toward me. You were there. I breathed in slow and let my pulse settle behind my ribs. A photograph is a trap for the untrained. It makes you defend a moment you didn't live or confess a moment you did. I blinked once and looked at the wall beyond his shoulder, as if reading a poster that wasn't there. The man behind me shifted his weight. Enough, he muttered. Names. I closed my eyes for the length of a heartbeat and found the rhythm I used on long nights with the radio. Count 3, hold 2, release on 1. There was a map inside me no one could see. Safe houses turned to ashes, couriers already over the border, a farmer who hid detonators in sacks of grain. The map had no words. That was the point. If they opened me like a book, they would find only blank pages. The officer leaned in until I could see the nick on his jaw where his razor had slipped. You think we don't know? I let a small, tired smile touch my mouth, the kind a nurse might give a child insisting the thermometer was wrong. He hated that. Anger is easier to manage than charm. Anger makes men predictable. He tapped the last photograph. Final chance. I let the silence stretch until it felt like another body in the room. The bulb hummed. Water dripped somewhere beyond the wall. When I finally spoke, my voice was quiet enough to make him lean closer. You already have my name, I said. It's the only one you'll get. They took away the chair before the pain could settle, made me stand facing the wall with my hands still bound. The brick was cool against my forehead. Some interrogators prefer questions. These preferred time. Footsteps came and went. Keys. Doors. The bulb's hum turned into a metronome for doubt. I did not let it count me. He returned without his jacket, sleeves rolled, the manner of a man who had decided to be efficient. He set a small notebook on the table and a fountain pen beside it, in reach. Write them, he said. No speeches, just names. The pen caught the light like a thin blade. I imagined picking it up and drawing a line straight through the page, one long refusal. I kept my hand still. He tried a different road. You think they would keep your name? He said softly. They would give you up to save themselves. Why protect people who would not protect you? I let the words pass through me like smoke. They look for the resentment that lives in everyone. If they find a spark, they can build a fire. When silence didn't move me, he placed 3 objects on the table: a scarf, a watch, a cigarette case. None were mine. All could have belonged to someone I loved. It was a good trick. Memory is a weapon. We found these during a search, he lied with care. We can be generous if you are. I studied the cigarette case until my eyes watered, then looked away as if bored. Boredom unsettles men who expect tears. The second man returned, carrying a ledger. He read names aloud. Common, harmless. Then he began to invent. A child's name, a priest's, a baker's wife. All of them suffer because you will not speak. I pictured my breath as a small animal I needed to keep still in my chest. If it moved, they would hear it and hunt it. Hours became a season. They took the bulb and left me in a gray that wasn't quite dark. Sleep stalked the edges of the room. I did not let it catch me. When they brought me back to the chair, the tea had turned to syrup. "Listen," he said, lowering his voice as if we were conspirators. "Say one name that checks, just one, and I will see that you leave tonight. You can go south. You can forget this place. Promises are cheap in rooms like this. The currency is desperation. I had traded mine away long ago." He tried philosophy. "Loyalty is a word the powerful sell to the poor," he said. "Save yourself." They would. I thought of the boy in the church, counting his breaths. Of the farmer's wife who had a radio in a cradle. Of Henry's hands, steady even when the world shook. I had seen ordinary people choose courage when there was nothing to gain by it. That is power no uniform understands. When patience thinned, procedure followed. They asked the same question in different skins, places, dates, the names for tools only we would know. I answered with the weather, then with a story about a market, then with silence so smooth it felt like glass. Confusion is a kind of resistance. If every path leads nowhere, they will waste strength walking them. At some point he leaned close enough that I could see the pale ring on his finger where a wedding band had been. For a heartbeat, I saw him as a man who went home to a quiet room and a lamp his wife once chose. Compassion is dangerous in here. It opens a door you cannot close. I shut it gently. "Last offer," he said, tired now. "Write one name. Any name. You do not even have to sign it." I looked at the pen as if considering. Then I met his eyes and let the smallest, kindest smile rise. "You already have my name," I said again. "It's the only one I carry." His hand struck the table hard enough to startle the cup. Porcelain rattled. He stood, smoothed his sleeve, and left without another word. The door closed. The room breathed. I counted the bricks again, one by one, until the number became a prayer that had no saints and needed none. They changed the room before they changed the method. A different chair, a window painted shut, a calendar with no dates. Routine is part of the pressure. They want you to feel that time belongs to them. The next officer wore gloves. He didn't sit. He read from a file as if the words themselves were evidence. "You purchased coffee on Ruby 3 weeks ago. With whom?" I thought about the smell of roasted beans, about how memory can be a greater comfort than sleep. I said nothing. He stepped closer, listening to my silence the way a doctor listens to a cough. "We will find them with or without you," he said. "Your choice only decides how you are remembered." I almost laughed. Men like him believed history could be written from behind a desk. They took the pen away. When the questions circled back to the rail lines, I let my mind go to the river. A small stone bridge. Children racing twigs in the current. Water moving past obstacles without argument. I made my thoughts into water and let them pass around his words. Fatigue is a door that opens by itself. I braced it with little things, multiplying by sevens, reciting the names of markets and towns I'd never seen, counting the beats between his questions and the tap of his shoe. At last he tried the shortest path. Names. I lifted my eyes and let them rest on his for the first time. I wanted him to see that there was nothing left for him to take. "No," I said. The word surprised us both with how gently it landed. Not defiance. Decision. He nodded once, as if accepting a weather report he disliked, and left me with the humming bulb and the cold cup. Alone again, I loosened fear the way one loosens a knot, slowly, deliberately, without hurry. I rolled my shoulders against the ropes until I found a less cruel angle. I breathed in force. I pictured a door opening somewhere far from here, the sound of fresh air and leaves. If they meant to break me, they would have to live long enough to watch me heal. When the guard returned to move me, he didn't meet my eyes. He kept his hand light on my elbow, professional, distant. People think mercy travels only in grand gestures. Sometimes it arrives as the absence of cruelty. In the corridor, I heard another door open, another voice begin to answer. I sent a silent message through the wall the way we used to send them over radio. Hold. Brief. You are not alone. They moved me to a holding cell that smelled of lime and damp straw. The door shut with a soft finality, the kind that tells you they plan to keep you long enough to see if you keep yourself. I took inventory the way we were taught. 4 paces wide, 6 paces long, 1 cot, 1 bucket, a slit of a window painted black. No nails in the walls, no loose stone. But I still looked, because looking was a way of refusing. Control, in a place like this, is measured in centimeters. I straightened the blanket. I folded it twice. I aligned the cot with the wall until the metal feet stopped wobbling. Pointless, maybe, but it made the room answer to me, not the other way around. Hunger arrived as a suggestion before it became a demand. They brought a tin bowl, thin soup with something pretending to be bread. I thanked the guard in a voice I reserved for strangers on trains. Politeness unsettles men who expect either begging or rage. He set the bowl down without a word and left as if he had interrupted a prayer. In the quiet, I reviewed the rules we'd carved into ourselves long before this day. Never speak a name. Never confirm a fact they assert. If a detail must be given, let it be one they already know. Believe in no mercy you haven't seen. I tested my wrists against the cords of the last hours. The skin burned, but the hands still closed, still opened. Good. I would need hands to hold on to my own mind. The first night, I counted heartbeats to pace the dark. The second, I counted footsteps in the corridor and matched them to the guards who owned them. The heavy one with the heel that dragged, the quick one who hummed through his teeth, the careful one who paused outside every door as if listening for confession through wood. Naming them by sound made them smaller. At dawn, someone slipped a scrap of paper under the door, empty but for a faint crease. It wasn't a message. It was a test. If I reached for it and they entered, they'd know I was starved for contact. I left it there until noon, then moved it with the side of my shoe and used it to level the cot's bad leg. When the guard saw, his mouth twitched. Annoyance or amusement, I couldn't tell. Either one meant I had changed the shape of the room again. By evening, they would come back for more questions. I sat on the edge of the cot, palms open, breath steady. If this was to be a war of waiting, I would wait like a stone waits for a river, not resisting the water, not surrendering to it, simply enduring until the water forgot what it wanted from me. They woke me by slamming the hatch, then made me wait another hour before opening the door. Delay is discipline. I stood before they told me to, smoothed the blanket, left the room tidier than I'd found it. A small rebellion they could not forbid. Back under the bulb, a new face took the chair, younger, careful, rehearsed. He arranged 3 sheets of paper, each with a different list of names. Identify which list contains your acquaintances, he said. I let my eyes pass over them once. 2 lists were nonsense, a jumble of common surnames. The third contained 2 real names and a dozen wrong ones. It was bait. I studied the ceiling instead, counting hairline cracks that ran like rivers. He tapped the page. We already know. This is only verification. Verification is the friendly cousin of confession. I gave him the same companion I had given the others, silence. When silence didn't satisfy, he unfolded a map. Pins bit into towns I had walked through in the dark. He asked me to trace the route I had taken for my own safety. I smiled at the map as if it were a child's drawing of a country that didn't exist. I don't travel, I said softly. I keep house. His jaw shifted, annoyance quickly hidden. They tried fatigue again. Questions in loops, questions that contradicted each other, questions that invited me to correct him. Correction is another trap. If you fix a lie, you give them a truth. I answered with weather and markets, with the price of bread last spring, with the name of a dressmaker who never lived. He wrote it all down like scripture. At the edge of the table sat a tin of lozenges. He took one, then, almost kindly, offered the tin. For your throat. I glanced at it, then at him. I don't speak, I said. My throat is fine. The older officer behind him made a small sound, halfway between a laugh and a cough. He shifted tactics. Your husband, he said, watching my face. We know what happens to men married to women like you. A cold wind passed through my chest, and I let it go through without moving a leaf. I pictured a shoreline and the steady fall of waves. I pictured handwriting I knew by touch alone. I gave him nothing. When they sent me back to the cell, dusk had settled into the corridor like dust. The careful guard, the one who paused outside doors, walked me without a hand on my elbow. At the threshold, I turned my head just enough to catch his eye. "Good night," I said, ordinary as rain. He blinked once, surprised by the simple civility, then closed the door gently instead of letting it slam. In the dark, I let my strength return the way tide returns to shore, quietly, inevitably. If they were writing a report, I wanted it to say only this: subject remains unproductive. Subject remains composed. Subject remains. They tried mourning as if sunlight could do what darkness couldn't. A tray clattered down, black coffee, a heel of bread, a hard-boiled egg with a crack like a fault line. I ate slowly, as if time belonged to me. Haste is a kind of surrender. Before noon, they brought me to a different office, windows high, a radio on a shelf, a potted plant that had given up the pretense of living. The officer here wore wire-rimmed spectacles and a wedding band. He did not look at me when he spoke. "Your file suggests intelligence, discipline, and theatricality." He tapped the folder. "You are not unique. We have procedures for your type." I almost smiled. Every empire thinks insurgents come in types. That is how empires sleep at night. He began with dates and little mistakes, offering me chances to correct him. When I didn't, he sighed, removed his glasses, and chose a story. "A man was taken last week," he said. He gave us a name. A woman's name. He watched me through the fog of his breath on the lenses. I pictured a weather map over his head: cold front, light precipitation, low chance of truth. "If you confirm the name," he added, "we will stop looking at you." There it was, the bargain that tasted like mercy but worked like a hook. I let the quiet fill the corners. He switched on the radio low, an orchestra buried under static. "We can wait all afternoon." I listened to the violins pretend at peace. I thought of the boys who carried messages through orchards, of women who baked codes into loaves, of a field where a friend fell without a cry. I could wait longer than an afternoon. At last he leaned back. "You people misjudge what we can endure," he said. "You think we don't grow used to this?" I shook my head once. "No," I said softly. "I think you do." For a moment, he looked almost grateful to be told the truth. When he sent me away, the careful guard walked me past a door left just ajar. A whisper slipped out, 2 syllables, nothing I knew. I kept my pace. If someone needed courage, they could borrow the sound of my footsteps, steady as a metronome. Back in the cell, I found the scrap of paper had been removed and the cot sat level without it. A small kindness or a bureaucratic correction. Either way, I accepted it the way a tree accepts rain without asking from which cloud it fell. Night came like a held breath released. I lay on my side, eyes open, and let memory choose the scene. A bridge at dusk, the river carrying leaves like little boats, Henry's laughter moving through me like warmth. Pain receded the way tide pulls back from rock, not gone, but less loud. I slept briefly and woke ready. Not strong, ready. They changed the hour, not the question. Dawn this time, thin light creeping under the door, the kind that makes faces look already tired. They sat me without binding my wrists, as if trust could be a tactic. It was. A folder lay open but untouched. The officer clasped his hands. "This can end with dignity," he said. "Yours." I studied the scuff on his left shoe where the leather had split. Men who talk about dignity seldom notice their own seams. He slid a single sheet toward me. A typewritten statement with blank spaces where names should be. "Fill 3 lines," he said. "Only 3. 3 is a merciful number. 3 is a door that looks small enough to slip through without consequence. But 3 names are a thread that unravels a city." I placed my fingertips on the paper as if feeling for graying. Then I pushed it back so gently the air barely moved. "No," I said. He nodded, as if he had been waiting to hear me say it one last time. He stood, came around the table, and lifted the statement off the wood. For a second, the paper hovered above the wastebasket. Then he set it back on the desk, smooth as a hand over a child's hair. "Very well." They walked me to a courtyard. Cold bit through my dress like teeth. 2 walls met at a right angle, pocked with old chips. Someone had painted over the marks, but paint does not persuade stone to forget. A squad assembled without ceremony. The sergeant counted softly, not to me, but to himself. The careful guard stood aside, jaw tight. I watched a sparrow hop along the roofline and cock its head as if listening for my name. The blindfold they offered was clean. I refused it. If I had to meet an ending, I would watch it arrive. "Last chance," the officer said, voice even. I thought of the market at noon, of apples stacked like planets, of the prayer a mother makes over a sleeping child without a god to catch it. Then I thought of nothing at all. The command rose. A click ran along the rifles like rain on gutters. The world became a single, still breath. From the doorway behind us, a shout. Papers, running feet, the specialized chaos of interrupted procedure. Someone thrust a document into the officer's hand. A stay, a transfer, a reclassification no one in the yard cared to understand. The sergeant lowered his arm with a disgust too tired to be called relief. They marched me back inside. The careful guard's shoulder brushed mine by accident. His hand closed and opened once, the smallest human gesture I had seen in that building. In the corridor, the officer spoke without looking at me. "Your people are clumsy," he said. "You will fall because they are not worth your silence." I let the words pass like a draft under a door. If clumsy people had carried me this far, then clumsiness had done a miracle's work. Back in the cell, I sat on the cot and placed my palms flat on my knees. The room tilted for a second, shock arriving late, as it often does. I breathed until the walls returned to their nails and paint. Then I did the only useful thing left to do. I slept. Real sleep, deep and black, the kind that does not ask permission. When I woke, a piece of bread waited on the floor beside a dented tin of water. No note, no footsteps fading, just the bread, plain as a fact. I ate slowly. The taste was nothing. The act was everything. I was still here. They had nothing I wanted and everything I would not give. Night fell with a soft hand. Somewhere in the building, a radio bled a waltz into the stairwell. I counted bars until the song ended, and when the silence came, it felt like a friend sitting close without needing to speak. Morning arrived like a verdict written in gray. They opened the door without the courtesy of a knock and told me to stand. I did, smoothing the blanket with one hand as if I had guests. Politeness, even here, was a kind of armor. They marched me not to the interrogation rooms, but down a stairwell that breathed cold. Basement air, damp, metallic. A clerk with ink-stained fingers waited at a desk too small for the stack of files drowning it. He did not look up when he spoke. Sign for personal effects. There were none to sign for. I pressed the pen to the page and left it clean. He glanced at the blank line, then at me, and for a heartbeat I saw a person under the ink. Tired, compromised, and not yet cruel. He slid the ledger away without complaint. They put me in a different cell, narrower, with a pipe that ticked like a watch. On the wall, a faint rectangle where a calendar had once hung. Someone had taken time away and left its shadow. I sat and mashed my breath to the pipe until it belonged to me. Hours later, maybe midday, maybe midnight, they brought a woman past my door, wrists bound, haircut close. She moved like someone who had learned to make herself small without becoming less. When the guard stopped to adjust his keys, her eyes found mine. No plea, no panic, just a steady message anyone could read. Hold. I answered with the smallest nod I could make without moving. They fed us late. The careful guard set a bowl inside the threshold and, with a motion so slight it could have been an accident, nudged something under the rim with his thumb. A sliver of paper no bigger than a fingernail. I lifted the bowl, drank, then let the last mouthful linger so I could palming the scrap and press it under my cuff. In the corner, with my back to the door, I unfolded it. 2 marks only, one long, one short, drawn in pencil. Not a word, a rhythm, a time. Someone, somewhere in this building, would do something when the pipe ticked twice fast. I closed my eyes and listened for the practice run. Nothing came. Good. If it was real, there would be only one. By evening, the officer with the spectacles returned, softer at the edges, as if the day had worn him down to a quieter metal. He stayed in the doorway. "You are stubborn," he said without malice. I tilted my head. "You are thorough." The concession surprised him into a smile he did not permit. He raised a hand, let it fall. "A transfer is being considered. Another facility, more specialized." I let my gaze pass through him to the ticking pipe. "You do what you must," I said. He left the door open long enough for the corridor's light to lay a clean stripe across the floor. It felt like a window a child had drawn with chalk, bright and temporary and perfectly square. When the lock turned, the light collapsed into the seam, but the line it had traced stayed in my head like a path. I waited in the posture of sleep until the building settled. Boots thinned. Voices went to whispers. The pipe ticked steady as a heart under a palm. I counted 60 breaths, then 60 more. The signal came like a swallow changing direction, 2 quick ticks out of sequence, almost playful if you didn't know how much blood a joke could cost. I slid from the cot and put my fingers to the floor, feeling for the vibration of feet. Nothing near. I moved to the door and bent, bringing my mouth to the cold iron. Ready. I breathed into the seam that carried sounds like a wire. Far down the corridor, something answered with a soft scrape. Not language. Agreement. Keys approached from the wrong direction. A guard on the reverse round. I sat, folded my hands, and arranged my face into patience. He paused, looked through the hatch, saw a woman waiting to be asked the same questions again. He moved on. When the corridor settled a second time, the scrape returned, closer. A thin length of metal shivered in the lock and failed, shivered again and held. The bolt sighed. The door gave a fraction and then stopped, chain caught. I lifted the plate, eased the chain with 2 fingers until it lay slack like a tired snake. The door opened the width of my hand. A shape slid into the gap, a bundle of cloth, not a person. Inside, a plain dress, a scarf, soft-soled shoes, and a string tag with 3 numbers written in a careful, anonymous hand. The kind of outfit that could pass through a city without leaving an imprint. I dressed quickly, tucking my hair under the scarf, folding the prison air off my skin as if it were a garment I could choose not to wear. The shoes hugged the floor without speaking. I set the prison issue aside in a stack neat enough to be mistaken for laundry. At the threshold I waited, hand on the edge, breath held at the top like a diver's. The careful guard's shadow passed, paused, did not turn. Some mercies come from courage, some come from exhaustion. Either one opens a door. I slipped into the corridor and closed the cell soft. The building's night sounds mapped themselves around me. Distant radio, a cough, paper turning under a clerk's hand. I moved when the pipe ticked, stopped when it didn't, becoming one more beat in someone else's metronome. Down one flight, past a window painted black, through a room where a plant had died trying to be green. The ledger desk sat empty, but for dust. On the blotter lay a rubber stamp that said verified in a font that tried too hard to be certain. I pressed it once into my palm and left the word there without ink, a private joke between me and the men who had asked for names. At the exit, a latch waited with the patience of metal. Beyond it, a yard. Beyond the yard, a street that led to a corner where a woman might become part of the weather. I put my ear to the wood. Breaths, 2. Then the swallow turn of the pipe's double tick sounded again, far, faint, final. I opened the door and stepped into air that smelled of coal and bread and the sleep of strangers. No one shouted. No whistle blew. I walked, not fast, not slow, the way a woman walks when she is returning from a visit that ended late and well. At the end of the block, a truck coughed to life and pulled away, its canvas back swallowing 3 shadows I chose to believe were the others. I did not look twice. Sometimes faith is just a decision about where to place your eyes. I turned the corner and let the city take me. Cobbles, shutters, a cat leaping a gap that looked too wide and wasn't. Behind me, a siren began and died. Ahead, the night opened like a book whose pages had been waiting for my hands. I walked until the rhythm of my steps became ordinary, until my shadow belonged to the lamps and not to the men behind them. Windows were shut, but the city was awake in its quiet ways, pots cooling on stoves, a radio whispering through thin walls, a child turning in sleep and tugging a blanket up to the chin. At the third intersection, I crossed to the side with the broken pavement. Shoes remember routes. Mine needed to learn a new one. 2 corners later, I paused to tie a scarf that did not need tying and counted to 12. The number Henri favored when caution mattered more than speed. A tram clanged by with just enough passengers to make invisibility possible. I climbed on and found a place by the rear window, spine loose, gaze soft, the posture of someone thinking only of the next morning's errands. On the glass, my reflection looked like a woman who had never been asked a question she didn't wish to answer. At the river, I stepped off with 3 others. The bridge wore the night like a shawl. Water slid beneath it, patient and sure. On the far bank, I walked past a bakery that smelled of heat sleeping, then turned down a lane swallowed by vines. The door I needed had a brass number that had lost its shine and a keyhole that never worked. I knocked the way we taught each other to knock when we had nothing left but the code our hands could keep. 2, 1, pause, 1. No answer. Good. Silence meant a plan was still a plan. I went to the end of the lane and stood under the tree that held its leaves longer than it should, and I waited. Minutes settled on my shoulders like dust. A cat tested the air and decided I was furniture. When the bell and the quarter struck, a window cracked open just wide enough for a hushed breath to fit through. Are you hurt? No, follow the shadow. The alley behind the bakery had a door that was not a door until the flour sacks moved. I passed through and into a warmth that made my eyes sting. Hands reached, not to hold me, but to steady the room. Someone set a cup down. I did not drink. Someone offered a chair. I remained standing until the trembling found a way to leave my bones. We heard the courtyard, a woman said. Her hair was pinned with the kind of care that forgives no mistakes. She gauged the edges of me like a tailor reading a difficult seam. You kept it. I nodded. They did not ask what I had said in the room with the bulb. They knew better than to make me repeat the shape of refusal. Instead, they asked what had changed, the names being fished from rumor, the patrols, the routes you could still take if you wore shoes that apologized for themselves. We spread a map on the baker's table. It smelled of crust and strategy. I pointed with a crumb, not a finger. Here, I told them without words. The keys turn from the wrong side. Here the guards listen before they walk. Here the pipe ticks twice when courage aligns. We planned softly, like people teaching a child to sleep. When the lamp burned low, I let them lead me to a narrow room above the ovens where the walls had learned to hold heat and secrets. On the pillow, a sprig of something green waited like proof that living things still insisted. I lay down fully dressed, shoes by the door, scarf folded beneath the edge of the mattress so I could snatch it without thinking. Sleep came carefully and then all at once. I woke to the sound of dough being persuaded into bread. Flour drifted in the air like a quiet snow. The woman with the pins set a cup before me, and this time I drank. Water cool enough to make the world soften at the edges. They will look for you, she said. They always do, I answered. And you? I let the question sit between us until it lost its teeth. I will go where names are safest, I said, where they are not spoken even inside the head. We burn the scarf and the dress in the oven's first heat. Cloth lifts its ghosts when it burns. I watch them rise and vanish into the morning like promises you don't need anymore. In their place, she gave me a skirt with a mended hem and a dark coat that could belong to anyone with a list of errands and a quiet temper. Before I left, I pressed her hand once. Not gratitude. That would come later in the form of flour and sugar smuggled past ration lines. Recognition. Some wars end at borders. Ours ended every time a door opened for the right knock. Outside, the tram bell argued with a bicycle, and someone scolded a dog for loving too loudly. I walked with the city until the city forgot to notice me. By noon I was another woman in a market that had decided to exist. Eggs in a basket, apples with bruises disguised as color. A butcher sharpening a blade with the patience of a man who believes the world has returned to reasonable work. A boy bumped my hip and apologized without looking up. I slipped a note into the cuff of his sleeve the way a mother fixes a button. 1 second, 1 touch, nothing to remember. He ran, as boys do when the errand matters, and turned the corner already older. By evening, word would find the places it needed to reach. Safe houses closing before the knock, radios packed in flour sacks, a woman in the next arrondissement changing the route she walks to fetch milk. As for me, I chose a different street and a different dusk, and let the city stitch me back into its fabric at a seam only we knew how to find. Night folded over the rooftops, and I moved with it, choosing streets that curved instead of ending, doors that opened inward, faces that knew how to look past me without seeing. In the stationer's shop, I bought a pencil and a packet of blank cards. The owner wrapped them with care, tied string with a flourish meant for better days. I left a coin too much. Overpaying is a language every occupation understands. At the first corner cafe, I sat with my back to the wall and wrote nothing. Blank cards travel farther than words. I stacked them, shuffled them, slid one beneath the saucer, one beneath the chair leg, one into the pocket of a coat left on a hook. The woman who owned the coat would carry it home and never know she was walking a message across the city, the message being simply that a path still existed. By afternoon, I had a rhythm. Walk 2 streets ordinary, 1 street careful. Stop when the bells chime, move when the tram sighs. I let the day study me until it decided I belonged. Near the river, a boy selling newspapers called headlines that were mostly lies. I bought one and read the spaces between the words. There, an announcement about ration books traded to a different office. To anyone else, bureaucracy. To us, a door moving from one hinge to another. Under a bridge arch, a courier I didn't know waited with a crate of eggs. He did not look at me. Nice weather, he said to the water. It will change, I answered, tying my shoelace. He nudged the crate with his toe, one egg the wrong color, shell a shade too pale. I pocketed it and walked on. Inside, a roll of paper thinner than prayer. 2 names I already knew and a route I did not. Good. The city was learning new steps without me. At dusk, I returned to the bakery by a different street and found the oven warm and the room empty. On the table, flour drawn with 2 lines and a curve, like a river with a ferry crossing. I traced it once with my fingertip and blew it away. Maps are for moments, not for keeps. You should sleep, the woman said from the doorway, scolding and kind. Later, I said, we have one more door to close. She nodded, pinned her hair tighter, and brought me a coat that smelled of clean smoke. We passed through alleys where cats owned the stones and into a courtyard where laundry had learned to dry in shadows. On the 3rd floor, a door opened to the knock that belonged to us. Inside, a man with a bandaged forearm and eyes that shook when his hands didn't. He held out a ledger, pages neat and lethal. I set it on the stove and lit a match. The flame read each line before swallowing it. When it was done, I crushed the ash and opened the window to let the names become weather. You've lost enough, I told him. Not everything, he said, looking at the bandage as if it were a country map. We shared a silence that knew what it was for. On the way back, rain began, thin, persistent, impartial. It polished the streets and blurred the chalk lines of patrol routes until even the soldiers had to guess. Rain is democracy. It falls on everyone. I slept an hour before dawn and woke with the certainty that they would return to where I had been, not where I was going. So I went the other way. By midday, the tram carried me past the building that had almost kept me. A window stood open that had never opened before. A curtain breathed out, and in, like the city practicing not to be afraid. I didn't look long. Looking is a weight you carry past usefulness. I let the tram take me toward a quarter where the baker's cousin kept a room and a story and a kettle that almost boiled. When I arrived, she wiped her hands on her apron and studied my face the way a nurse reads a thermometer. You will need a new name, she said. No, I answered. I'll borrow silence instead. She chuckled, then grew serious and set a plate before me. Eat, she said. You can't starve the truth out of yourself. I ate. I let warmth return without asking where it had been. When I finished, she pushed a folded paper across the table. A train schedule. 1 train circled in pencil, not because I should board it, but because no one should. I nodded and slid it into the lining of my coat. The day thinned into evening. I lit a lamp, then blew it out. The dark held. I found it kind. At first light, I walked to the market with a basket and an old coat that belonged to nobody in particular. The stallholders talked in prices and weather. The city exhaled like a patient allowed to sit up. I bought nothing, asked nothing, waited until the rhythm of trade hid the rhythm of my thoughts. Near the fountain, a soldier lit a cigarette and cupped the flame with both hands, sheltering it like a prayer. He looked past me without seeing me. I looked past him without hating him. Hatred is loud. Loud things get caught. I turned down a street that had survived the war by learning to look like it had nothing to say. At the end, a tailor mended a seam with the concentration of a surgeon. I left a coat for repair that did not need repair and gave him a name that didn't belong to me. He nodded once, wrote it wrong on purpose, and pushed a spool of thread across the counter. Inside the spool, a strip of paper curled tight as a secret. 3 addresses marked with dots, not words. Dots were kinder than names. Dots kept people alive. At noon, I crossed the boulevard with the slow assurance of a woman counting recipes in her head. A tram bell warned, impatient, and the driver shook his head as if the city's clumsiness offended him personally. I let the scold wash over me and kept walking. A policeman turned, then changed his mind about caring. Indifference is a door if you know how to walk through it. In a quiet arcade, I stopped to polish a shoe that didn't need polishing. The boy with a newspaper pouch appeared as if the stall had invented him. He wiped the other shoe, awkward and precise, and in the downward sweep of his rag, he left a matchbox between my heel and the floor. The matchbox was heavier than matches. Inside, a ticket stub, a biscuit, and a sliver of mirror. The stub told me we're not to be at 5. The biscuit said someone remembered I might be hungry. The mirror was a warning in case I forgot to check who walked behind me. I spent the next hour turning corners until the streets lost interest and the mirror stopped telling me any stories. Then I walked into a church where the air had the weight of kept promises. I lit no candle. I spoke no prayer. I sat in the back pew and listened to the old wood settle, to the close breath of stone. The silence accepted me without questions, the way good friends do. When I rose, an old woman with a scarf tied square met me at the font. "You look like my daughter," she said. "I'm not," I answered. "No," she said, smiling, "but you're someone's." She pressed something into my hand, a rosary with one bead missing. I carried it to the door and left it on the rail for the next person who needed counting. At 4, I stood in the shadow of a shuttered cinema and watched the faces of people who still believed in stories with endings. Across the street, a man adjusted a hat that didn't fit him. Too new, too careful. He watched the doorway, not the street. Professionals watch doorways. I drifted, became wallpaper, and let a tram pass between us like a curtain. By 5, I was 3 streets away from the ticket stub I'd been given. A commotion started there, whistles, argument, the sound of procedure stretching to cover embarrassment. Whoever they had hoped to find had chosen a different day. Evening cooled the stones. I turned one last corner and arrived at a door that answered to a knock only the tired remembered. 1, 1, 2, and then patience. It opened to a room with a table, 3 chairs, and a kettle that had already learned my name. We sat without introductions. No one needed them. One of the men unfolded a map and weighed the corners with cups. Not the city map from yesterday, the one you use when you've decided to move the center of the world a little to the left. We counted hours, not days. We assigned errands that looked like chores. I took the task with the least glory and the most possibility of boredom. Sit on a bench near the station and knit nothing with needles that held no yarn. I could do that. I could sit so still that even my breath seemed borrowed. Before I left, the woman, no pins in her hair now, just certainty, touched my sleeve. "If they ask again," she said, "what will you give them?" I looked at the steam from the kettle thinning into nothing and smiled. "Silence," I said. "It weighs less than grief and carries further." Night came on. I walked out into it and let it wear me like a pocket. I didn't look back at the door or the map or the cups holding corners in place. I looked forward to the place where names become dots and dots become routes and routes become people arriving home with no one the wiser. The air smelled of coal and wet stone. Somewhere a radio tried to teach the dark a waltz. I mashed my steps to it. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and disappeared into the measure. Morning put a thin skin of frost on the benches by the station. I sat with empty needles and let my hands remember a pattern my grandmother never taught me. The square filled with the theater of travel. Men carrying cases they could not lift alone. Women counting children twice. Officials pretending the clipboard made the world reasonable. I kept my eyes on the clock, then on the pigeons, then on the way shadows shortened as if the sun were impatient. At the far end of the platform, a man adjusted his hat twice and never looked at the train schedule. Another stood too straight for a civilian. Professionals again. They didn't search for me. They searched for anyone who moved like a reason. At 9, a woman in a blue coat sat beside me and began to knit the same nothing I did. Her needles clicked without yarn. "Cold morning," she said to the air. "It will warm," I answered, eyes on the clock. Her bag bulged at one corner. Bread, by the look of it, and something heavier wrapped in paper. We waited through the 10-minute delay that always arrives when someone important is late. A boy ran past with a kite he wasn't allowed to fly here, trailing a tail made of ration cards. The man with the too new hat reached to stop him, then didn't, and in that hesitation the boy tied the kite to the rail and left it there, flagging nothing to anyone but us. The woman in the blue coat rose, smoothed her skirt, and left the bag at my feet as if it had grown too heavy. I did not touch it until the station clock clicked to the quarter. Then I lifted it and stood, turning my face to the tracks as if listening for an announcement. Inside the bag, under the bread, under brown paper, a bundle of cards, the kind you sign when you swear you will be good. They were blank. We had learned our lesson. I walked to the end of the platform and set the bag beside a pillar where a porter could mistake it for his. A minute later he did, and 20 minutes after that those cards would be somewhere else, cut into shapes that meant routes, not names. On the way back through the square, a hand brushed my sleeve. The careful guard. No uniform now, just hunger and sleep in his face. He didn't slow. You should leave the city, he murmured, not to me, not to anyone. They don't like unfinished work. He went on without turning. I did not change my pace. You can ruin the gift of a warning by treating it like a gift. At noon, I crossed the river with a small crowd of people who had decided the world might not end today. The water had thawed to its old argument with the banks. On the far side, a wind lifted the edge of my coat and tried to steal the heat I had earned. In a side street, a child drew a hopscotch ladder in chalk, skipping the number 7 because everyone knows 7 is for luck and luck shouldn't be stepped on. I smiled without showing teeth and walked around her game as if it were sacred ground. By late afternoon, I had become again what I needed to be, a woman with errands and nowhere urgent to go. The day folded itself into evening. I went home to a room that would not remember me and left by a door that would. When the knock came after dark, 2, 1, pause, 1. I opened it to the woman in the blue coat, hair damp with fog. She set a single loaf on the table, split it, and tapped the heel with her knuckle. Inside, not paper this time, but a thin radio coil wrapped tight as a secret. Tomorrow, she said. Tomorrow, I agreed. She looked at me as if measuring whether there was anything left to ask. If they take you again? I tied the coil into my sleeve, felt its small, stubborn weight against my wrist. Then I give them what I gave them before, I said. And what is that? Nothing that belongs to anyone else. At dawn we moved like the city moves when it is pretending not to, slow, practical, full of purpose disguised as chores. I carried a basket lined with a towel and the coil stitched into my sleeve like a stubborn vein. The woman in the blue coat walked 3 paces behind, then 3 ahead, then vanished into a doorway that had never belonged to her and did now. The safe room was on the 4th floor of a building that smelled of boiled cabbage and soap. We used the stairs. Elevators remember faces. Inside, the table was already cleared. A kettle hissed. A young man with solder burns on his fingers set out pieces the way a priest lays bread and wine, carefully, as if hands could atone for what the world had done. He didn't ask my name. He asked for my sleeve. I unpicked the stitches with a needle I carried everywhere and nowhere. The coil slid free, warm from my skin. He nodded once and began to build the spine of a voice from wire and patience. While he worked, I sat by the window that looked across a courtyard of quiet laundry. On a line, a single shirt lifted and fell as if practicing breath. I matched mine to it. Rise, fall, rise. The set woke in stages. A glow, a hum, a thread of static pulled taut between 2 worlds. I tuned the dial with the gentleness of turning a face toward light. The room gathered close without moving. We sent nothing at first. We listened. Listening is how you learn where to place a word so it will not be alone. The channel we needed opened like a door you knock at without hope. I felt the old rhythm in my bones, groupings, pauses, the patience of language that refuses to be hurried by fear. I took the key and began. A weather report that was not a weather report. A market price that was not a market price. A train schedule that described a movement of people who would never buy a ticket. The young man washed my hands as if they were telling him a story his mouth would never dare to speak. When the sweep hand on the clock reached the mark we had agreed upon, he touched my elbow, once a feather on water. I signed off with a greeting we had not used since the orchards were in bloom. Silence stepped back into the room and closed its coat. We broke the set down to its bones. The coil I stitched back into my sleeve. The rest fit into a lunch pail that would carry soup by noon and secrets by nightfall. On the stairs we met a woman with a bucket and a will to live. She glanced at the pail, at our faces, at the nothing we were carrying, and decided to keep her world intact by walking on. Courage is sometimes the discipline not to notice. At the street, I let the morning take me. Trams, bicycles, a dog tugging a child toward a smell only dogs understand. Normal is the camouflage people die for. I made it 2 corners before the air shifted. You learn to feel pursuit the way a sailor feels weather, shoulders tense, scalp prickling as if the sky had leaned down to whisper your name. I turned into a shop that sold thread and buttons and the kind of ribbon girls wear when their mothers can still protect them. The bell shivered. A man followed, not too near, not too far. Hat that fit, shoes that did not. He picked up a thimble and studied it as if it contained a map. I asked the clerk to wrap nothing. She did, hands steady. When she passed me the parcel, her fingers pressed mine. Once, twice. 2. The number we used when the door behind you had quietly opened. I left by the rear, into a yard that smelled of carrots and old rain. Across it, a gate half rusted, half resolved. Beyond, an alley that bent like a question. Steps behind me. Measured. Patient. I slowed. I stopped at a door that wore a medical cross no one had earned. I knocked as if my child had a fever. A nurse answered in a coat the color of bruised milk. She's burning, I said, voice low, urgent, true enough to pass from one mouth to another without a stumble. Her eyes flicked to the man's hat over my shoulder, then back to my face. This way, she said, and opened a corridor that was not a corridor until she opened it. I moved through iodine and whispers. At the far end, a curtain lifted without hands. Behind it, a door with a city on the other side and a name that could not be spoken because it was mine and therefore useless to anyone else. I stepped out, breathed once, and changed direction twice before the street could memorize me. The man did not follow. Either he had been given another task, or he had decided to believe the world was ordinary after all. By noon the coil was on its way under a pie crust. By evening, 3 routes had closed and 2 had opened, and a boy with ink on his fingers knew to burn a ledger before a stranger asked to see it. That night, when the knock came, a real one, a safe one, I opened to the woman with the blue coat and the young man with the steady hands. They said nothing. They didn't have to. We had sent a message across a city that hated messages. We were still here. I slept with my palms open on the blanket, as if the quiet might want a place to land. Winter thinned the crowds and thickened the silence. I learned to read the city by its breath, how steam rose from vents, how doors opened just wide enough for errands and not for questions. We worked in smaller circles, fewer hands touching each thing, no one carrying a whole story unless they had to die for it. One afternoon, fog moved in from the river and forgot to stop. I crossed the square with a basket of leaks and news that did not belong on paper. Halfway through, a truck idled with its canvas flaps tied back like eyelids forced awake. 2 men watched the crowd, not the road. I felt the air harden, the way milk does when someone turns their back on the stove. A girl of about 12 stumbled near me and dropped a loaf that split like a book. We both knelt. Inside, not a radio coil this time, but a length of wire and a bolt small enough to swallow. She snapped the loaf shut, eyes wide and steady. "Careful," I said softly, as if we were talking about crumbs. "Always," she answered and ran. Children should not carry the war. They carried it better than the rest of us. By dusk, the truck still hunted without moving. We adjusted. The bakery sent bread to the rear door of the hospital instead of the front. The tailor mended coats that took longer to pick up than to sew. Normal life became the costume that hid the play. 2 nights later, the knock came wrong. Not dangerously wrong, just enough to say wait. I blew out the lamp and let the room convince itself I had left. Footsteps paused, then continued down the hall. Minutes later, a slip appeared under my door. A single line, then a gap, then 3 dots. A meeting moved, a place changed, a route broken and rethreaded. I walked at midnight through streets the fog had sharpened into knives. A cat tracked me from a wall. A bicycle lay against a post like a promise someone meant to keep in the morning. At the end of the lane, the woman in the blue coat waited with her hands hidden in her sleeves. "There's talk," she said. "There's always talk." "No, about you, about the mouse." The nickname felt like a coat I had outgrown and could not throw away. "Then let them set traps," I said. "I'll teach them about holes in the wall." We moved the radio again, this time into a room above a cobbler who had lost 2 sons and kept working because leather still needed hands. As we tuned, a burst of noise tore through the set, too clean, too strong. Not ours. Fox's on the line. We killed the signal and listened to the echo die. Then we did what we had learned to do when a door slammed in our faces. We did nothing loud, and we did not move fast. Morning found the square in a cranky mood. Trams late, milk thin, soldiers bored enough to be cruel. I sat with a cup of coffee I didn't drink and watched the brickwork behind the checkpoint. Mortar crumbles and damp, so do men. By noon, the fog had lifted just enough to show the truck still there, the canvas blinking. I walked past it with my face arranged for errands and my pockets empty of anything but lint and patience. One of the men stepped forward, then stepped back, as if he'd remembered he had promised someone at home to survive the day. He let me pass. At the corner, I turned and turned again until the street forgot I had been on it. In my room, I folded my coat and lay down without closing my eyes. The ceiling had a crack shaped like a map of a country that didn't exist yet. I traced it with my gaze and thought of all the names I had not spoken, each one a thread holding that country together. When sleep finally came, it was brief and clean. I woke to the sound of a bell. 3 notes, not the churches, not the trams. A signal we rarely used because it meant now. I put on my shoes and left without touching anything I would miss. The street smelled of coal and rain. At the far end, a figure waited in the doorway of the stationer's, hat low, coat wrong. Not the hunter from before, another one. They were multiplying. I walked toward him as if I had rehearsed it. At the last second, I stopped to buy a pencil I didn't need and let a couple pass between us carrying a mirror that caught the man's face and gave it back to him honest. He looked older in the truth. I turned down a lane where the cobbles remembered the weight of horses. The signal sounded again, closer, softer, 3 notes, one held. I found the door with the scuffed threshold and the paint rubbed thin by hands that never learned when to quit. Inside, a room with a table and a radio spine waiting for its coil. We built the voice, sent the weather, moved the door, closed the route. We spoke in a language that used markets and wind for nouns and time for verbs. When we finished, the woman in the blue coat stood very still, as if listening for a word that hadn't been said yet. "They'll come again," she said. "Then we'll be here again." I answered, "And if they take you?" I wrapped the coil in my sleeve and tied the thread with a knot sailors use when they mean it. I'll give them what I gave them before, which is only my name. The next days braided themselves into a rope of routine and risk. I wore it like a belt and pretended it held up nothing heavier than a skirt. At the post office, the line moved with the speed of winter. Behind the counter, a clerk stamped envelopes as if saving the world required rhythm. I mailed a letter to no one, addressed to a village that had never had a postman. Inside, a blank page. Emptiness travels better than secrets. On the way out, I felt the street tilt, the subtle lean that says attention has turned toward you. A pair of boots hesitated, then resumed. A match flared in a doorway and died without lighting a cigarette. I let my steps go lazy, the amble of someone who trusts the afternoon to behave. At the market fountain, a boy I didn't know tugged at my sleeve and whispered sideways, "They ask for a woman with a coat like yours." I looked at my reflection in the water, blurred, older, nobody's problem. "Then someone should mend it," I said, and walked on. We shifted again, routes, faces, hours. I stopped using the tram that side at noon and began walking the street that apologized with potholes. I bought 2 apples and left one on a sill. At dusk, the apple was gone and a sliver of paper sat in its place, tucked under the paint. A phrase only we used, "The weather will clear on Wednesday." Wednesday meant midnight. Clear meant move. That night, I slept with one shoe on. By Wednesday, the city had a headache, the kind caused by uniforms being bored. I kept to walls and shop windows that gave back a little truth and a lot of lie. At midnight, I stood under a lamp that blinked like a tired eye and waited for a coach that wasn't a coach. It arrived as a milk cart, horse blowing steam like a dragon that had grown polite. I climbed in and sat on crates that smelled honest. We rolled through streets that had learned the art of looking empty. Halfway to the rendezvous, the horse flicked an ear and someone ahead coughed with intent. The cart slowed. 2 men stepped from the fog, gestures tidy, questions rehearsed. Papers. I handed them mine, the kind that fall apart if you stare too long. The older one read them as if the words might confess without my help. The younger one watched my eyes for the flinch that tells a story. "Where are you going at this hour?" "Home," I said. He looked at the milk. "Where is home?" "Where the milk is wanted." The older man snorted. The younger almost smiled. A second pair of boots approached from behind, measured, patient. A shadow overlapped mine and then withdrew. I recognized the posture before the face, the careful guard, wearing a different jacket and the same restraint. He took my papers from the older man, skimmed them, and handed them back as if bored by the shape of my life. "Let her go," he said. "She's late, and we are busy." He didn't look at me when he said it. He never did. We rolled on. When the coroner swallowed the soldiers, the driver let out a breath that fogged the air. "Friends?" he asked. "Acquaintances," I said. He clicked his tongue, and the horse agreed to believe in morning. At the last turn, we left the cart and continued on foot. 3 alleys, 1 courtyard, a door that remembered the right knock. Inside, heat and quiet and a map drawn on a table with string and pins. We moved 2 pins and cut 1 string. Names did not pass anyone's lips. They had not earned the right. Before dawn, I returned to the room that would not remember me and sat by the window with the curtain half closed. Across the street, a lamp went out in a pattern that meant safe for now. I let my shoulders drop for the space of a single breath. The knock came at noon, official, confident, eager for answers it believed it deserved. I opened to 3 men and the smell of damp leather. They searched politely at first, as if politeness could find a radio. They grew less polite. They found nothing I hadn't left for them to find: an apron, a spool of thread, a book with no pages worth reading. "You move like a woman who doesn't fear us," the tallest said. I tied the apron and wiped an imaginary table. "I fear nothing I do not invite," I said. They led me to the door as if the hallway belonged to them more than it did to air. In the stairwell, the careful guard waited on a landing, smoking a cigarette down to its manners. He did not meet my eyes. As we passed, ash fell, and with it a whisper only a floorboard would bother to remember. South. Not today. Outside, the truck yawned. I climbed in without being told. The canvas smelled of rope and old rain. I sat where the last woman had sat and left no dent. They took me not to the old building, but to a newer one that wanted to look like a hospital. White paint, clean corridors, the hum of machines that heal only the right kind of patient. A door opened onto a room with the same chair, the same table, the same bulb. Different city, same weather. The officer wore a uniform that fit as if it had been born with him. He leafed through a file that contained more paper than truth. "We begin again," he said, courteous as a butcher. I folded my hands. I let the quiet lay its coat over my knees. I gave him the same answer I had given the first room, and the second, and the courtyard, and the calendar with no dates. I gave him only my name. They asked the same questions in a cleaner room, as if fresh paint could bleach the truth out of me. A doctor watched from the corner with a clipboard he held like a shield. He took my pulse as though courage might be measured in beats per minute. "You understand," the officer said. "We already know. Knowing is the trick they love best. If they truly knew, they wouldn't need to ask." They set a metronome on the table and let it tick. Pace is pressure, pressure is policy. I let the tick become distant, like rain in another village. He walked me through places I had never stood and names I had never learned. When I did not refute them, he smiled, mistaking refusal for assent. If a river refuses to argue with the bank, it is not confessing the bank's importance. When patience thinned, the doctor cleared his throat. "Fatigue compromises judgment." "Not hers," the officer said, as if annoyed to find a wall where he had ordered a door. They brought in a woman who looked a little like me if you only looked with your hurry. Her hair was cut close. Her eyes were careful. She sat, folded her hands, and stared at a point 3 inches to my left. "She will confirm," the officer said. The woman breathed once, twice, then spoke as if to a wall she respected. I have never seen her before. We did not look at one another. Sisterhood is sometimes the art of keeping your gaze still. They sent her away. The officer softened his voice. "One name buys you the rest of your life." I thought of the tailor who misspelled mine on purpose, of the baker who burned routes into bread, of the careful guard whose mercy arrived disguised as indifference. "Then I am already rich," I said. He closed the file as if closing my future. "Transfer," he told the guard. "South facility." South meant harder miles and fewer witnesses. The road unfurled under a sky the color of unwashed wool. Fields blurred. Villages kept their distance. The guard across from me stared at my hands, curious about what they could hold without showing it. I kept them open on my knees. Halfway there, the truck slowed. A bicycle had fallen in the road. No rider, just a frame and 2 wheels still spinning like a decision not yet made. The driver leaned out and cursed. performed the ceremony of moving it to the verge. While he swore, a cart creaked past, piled with turnips and the smell of earth, the driver hat low against the weather. He didn't look at us. The turnips were wrong for the season. We rolled on. A kilometer later, the truck coughed, hiccuped, and died. Fuel, carburetor, fate pretending to be machinery. The driver banged the hood. The guard lit a cigarette and offended the sky with his smoke. 10 minutes. The driver muttered, crawling under the engine's temper. 10 minutes is a door if you already have the key. The guard left the canvas flap open to let the smoke escape. Beyond it, a ditch, a hedge, a field that couldn't decide whether it was winter or spring. I asked for water in a voice that could have belonged to any woman who had learned to live with men's timelines. He handed me the canteen and watched as if I might drown myself on the spot. I drank, passed it back, and shifted toward the open flap as if only to breathe. He didn't move. He had learned to trust boredom. The second cigarette burned faster. He flicked the butt. The wind returned it to his boot. He swore softly and bent to crush it. Bending is a dangerous verb for a man with a rifle. I slipped. Not loudly. Not bravely. Not like a hero. Like water. Canvas. Air. Ditch. Mud. Cold up to the shin, and then the thigh, and then the waist. The hedge took a handful of my coat as payment. I paid. Field. A furrow that remembered last season, a crow that approved of theft, soil that made no judgments. I kept low and let the earth claim me to the hips. The truck coughed back to life, the driver triumphant at his victory over bolts. The guard turned to boast and, for a blessed heartbeat, believed I was still where he had left me, inside his certainty. Only when the truck lurched forward did he notice the air had grown larger. Shouts, boots hitting mud the way a drum hits a parade. Rifle lifted, lowered, lifted, the hesitation of a man deciding whether paperwork is worse than failure. I didn't run. Running would have taught the field my name. I crawled as if the ground and I had always been relatives. At the far hedge, a gap whispered the word through. Beyond it, a path the color of intentions. At the end of the path, a cart with turnips that smelled of sawdust, not soil. The driver did not look at me when I slid beneath the sacking. He only clicked his tongue the way men do when their horse needs courage. We rode the long way that shortens your life. Twice, boots trotted along the road beside us, and once a hand struck the sacking to test if turnips grunt. These did not. In the next village, we stopped behind a smithy. The driver lifted the sack as if to adjust his cargo and left it ajar just enough for breath. Second house after the well, he said to his horse. Bread today, then apples. The horse twitched an ear. I took the hint. At the well, children argued about marbles as if the fate of empires were decided by glass. I counted to 12, Henry's number, and crossed to the second house. The door opened on my shadow and shut on my name. Inside, flour on a table, steam in the air, a radio coil sleeping in a bowl like a local saint. The woman there didn't ask me anything. She set a chair, then took it away and replaced it with another, as if chairs had opinions. They will keep looking, she said. It's their hobby, I answered. We ate soup that had forgotten meat and remembered kindness. While I warmed my hands on the bowl, the woman folded a dress the color of pavement and set it on my lap. For the road you don't take, she said. I slept an hour under a blanket that smelled of sun. When I woke, my coat had become a different coat, my hem a different hem, my pockets empty and therefore useful. At dusk, I left by a back door that had always wanted to be a front. The lane bent toward a road that bent toward a village that bent toward a horizon that had learned to keep secrets. Behind me, a bell rang once, the kind that says only this, good. Ahead, the sky broke into the kind of blue you don't trust yet. I walked until my shadow changed sides, and then changed back again, until the road forgot the shape of the truck and learned mine instead. When a farmhouse came, a roof, a door, a dog with more heart than sense, I knocked like a daughter returning late. A man opened, looked at my shoes, looked at the distance behind me, and stood aside. No names, he said. I don't carry any, I answered. I slept in the hayloft with stars wedged between the slats. In the morning, I would be another woman on another road with another basket and the same refusal folded clean inside her coat. And if they asked again, if the room with the bulb and the men with the questions found me anywhere the world could be narrowed to 4 walls, I would give them what I had given them every time. only my name. The road south unraveled like a ribbon someone had kept in a drawer too long, creased, stubborn, but still willing. Farms gave way to orchards that had survived by pretending not to be orchards, trees pruned into humility. I walked with a basket I didn't need and a purpose that couldn't afford the luxury of names. At the crossroads, a shrine wore a chipped saint and a fresh flower. I touched the stone the way people touch wood before storms. Superstition is just strategy dressed for church. A woman with a bicycle came from the east, tires sighing over grit. She stopped without looking at me, leaned the bicycle against the signpost, and inspected a stubborn chain. "Bad road," she said to the chain. "It gets worse," I answered to the dust. She lifted the saddlebag and set it down where my shadow fell. When the chain behaved, she pedaled away lighter than she had come. Inside the saddlebag, a loaf, a flask, and a folded apron with 3 careful stitches of red near the hem. Our mark for move now, not later. Under the apron, a small packet of paper brown and string tied. 5 cards with no words, only dots arranged like quiet constellations. Routes, not people. Responsibility, not betrayal. I cut across a field where the soil had the sweet smell of promised rain. A boy waved from a fence and asked if I'd seen his dog. "What's his name?" I asked. "He knows it," the boy said, and whistled a tune that didn't need a word. The dog came as if the world still made sense. I envied them both. By late afternoon, the road entered a town that owned 1 square, 2 cafes, and 3 opinions about everything. I chose the cafe with chairs that wobbled in a way carpenters never admit to. I ordered nothing. The owner poured me coffee anyway. Thick, kind, unasked. "You look like the kind who knows how to wait," he said. "It's a profession," I told him. On the opposite side, a gendarme admired his reflection in a shop window. Chin up, cap, just so. Authority in rehearsal. I let my gaze slide past him and rested it on a poster announcing a harvest dance that had been optimistic even when it was fresh. Behind the poster, under the staples, a sliver of paper showed its pale skin. Whoever had tucked it there knew the world reads boards only the first day. When the gendarme turned, I yawned like a woman thinking of laundry and let my hand borrow the corner of the poster long enough to free the sliver. 2 numbers, 1 cross. A time after dark. I left the cafe by leaving the coin I could afford and the gratitude I couldn't voice. In the alley, laundry flapped with the authority of flags. At the end, a door waited that had not been painted in a year and didn't mind. The room behind it smelled of starch and lemon. A seamstress looked up from her work with the expression of someone who trusts needles more than promises. She took in my coat, my shoes, the way my shoulders had learned to carry air. "Hem," she asked. 2 fingers, I said. She knelt, and while she pinned the cloth, she said the words that mattered. "There's talk of a sweep tonight. The truck that coughs. The officer with the spectacles. The doctor who takes pulses he never plans to save." I let the information settle like chalk dust. "Where?" Her hand paused at my shin, then moved on. "Near the mill. The lane with the stubborn dog. We'll move our weather," I said. She finished, stood, and brushed an invisible thread from my sleeve. "You should be gone by dusk," she added. "They like to collect people at tea time. It looks official." I paid with money and with a sentence I only gave to the few. "If my shadow passes your window twice in one night, burn your books." Her mouth tightened. Better to bury them in flour. "Better," I agreed. I took a back street that pretended not to lead anywhere, then another that agreed to be a mistake if anyone asked. At the river, the mills will turn old water into new noise. The dog barked with professional zeal. A boy's voice scolded, "Hush, Bruno, people are tired." Bruno disagreed on principle. Behind the mill, a door waited where no door should be, the kind that remembers it used to be a window. Inside, cool air and the sound of thread running through metal. The woman with the blue coat and the young man with the solder burns were already there, half silhouettes, half willpower. We spread the 5 wordless cards like a hand of patience. I tapped 2. The young man nodded, pulled a pencil from behind his ear, and drew the change we needed, a path that skirted the sweep like a cat passing an argument. We built the set on a crate stacked with sacks that had known flour and now knew conspiracies. The coil hummed, eager as a child. I tuned for the seam in the static and found it by touch. Weather tomorrow. No one listening for rain would have heard us. Everyone listening for mercy would. Halfway through the send, the dog barked again, not twice, not thrice, but in a pattern you hear with your spine. Boots in the yard, voices too careful to be neighbors. I closed with a market price and snapped the switch. The young man scattered our bones into a box of buttons. The woman swept dust over the scraps of wire as if tidying. We became furniture. The door opened to a man whose uniform had learned its authority from a mirror. "Inspection," he said, to the air, to the sacks, to the dog who resented being right. He poked where people who don't so think seamstresses hide things, behind curtains, under folded cloth, in jam jars that never fooled anyone. His hand paused inches from the crate. The woman's face made a shape that meant yesterday, not today. He turned, bored by the absence of applause, and left without looking at the floorboards, which is where the clever hide their worries. After the boots faded, I let air back into my lungs with ceremony. We packed the coil into the hem of the apron. The young man made the stitch that means tear here when you need the truth fast. We left by the door that used to be a window and returned to the road like two women and a boy who were late for the kind of chores a government understands. Dusk gathered its skirts. I walked past the gendarme again. He hadn't improved. At the shrine, the flower had wilted honestly. I left a fresh one I hadn't bought. Night took the town in its open hand. I stepped into it and became a coin in a pocket, a necessary weight, easy to forget. By the time I reached the last field before open country, frost had begun its quiet argument with the grass. I crossed, breath stitching little clouds into the dark, and thought of all the doors that would never remember my knock and all the names I had never said. Somewhere behind me, a truck coughed. Somewhere ahead, a light moved once behind a shutter and then went still, the way a lighthouse does when the ship has already found its line. I walked until the road chose me instead of the other way around. I walked until my feet remembered the old prayer, not safe, not soon through. And if the room, or a newer room, or a cleaner chair waited somewhere to begin again, I kept the answer ready where I had always kept it, behind my teeth, under my tongue, patient as bone. Only my name. South became hills that kept their own counsel. Paths braided through scrub and stone, goat tracks pretending to be roads, and then changing their minds. I followed the kind that didn't look like it wanted company. At a shepherd's hut, smoke unwound from a chimney no taller than a man's pride. I tapped the door with my knuckles. Once, twice, the pause that says I can leave as easily as I came. He opened with a face weathered into kindness and suspicion in equal measure. "Storm," he said, glancing at the sky. "2 days," I answered, glancing at his boots. He stood aside. Inside, a cot, a table, a kettle that had boiled for every fugitive who learned the word please. He poured me something that admitted to being tea only because it was warm and brown. "They came last week," he said, "with papers and questions. I told them the dog kept the books. And the dog cannot read." We let the joke sit and become a chair we both could use. I gave him a task that looked like mercy, forget me. He agreed with the relief of a man spared the weight of knowledge. At dawn I left a coin beneath the cup and my thanks in the way I shut the door, quiet, true. The ridge beyond the hut lifted the world into clean air. Below, a road unspooled toward a border that existed mostly in uniforms. Borders are questions. People are the answers. By mid-morning, I reached a culvert where a woman washed clothes with the fury of someone who has lost the luxury of sorrow. She didn't stop scrubbing when I stepped down. She only said, "Cold. Enough to teach you," I said. She jerked her chin at the far bank. "Not today." I nodded, sat, and waited with every patience I owned. When 2 soldiers wandered up and asked if she'd seen anyone, she didn't look at me. "Only stains," she said, "and they are stubborn. They laugh like men who needed proof of being men." When they left, she wrung a shirt hard enough to strangle a rumor and stood, water cutting paths down her forearms. "Now," she said. I crossed under the road where the culvert made a throat of stone. On the other side, a boy waited with a bicycle too tall for him. He handed me the handlebars as if we were trading salvation for errands. "Can you ride?" he asked. "Badly," I said. "Best way." He answered and ran uphill without looking back. I rode as if I had always been the sort of woman who rode bicycles at borders for pleasure. Wind scrubbed my lungs clean. The road lifted its chin. A lorry snarled past and forgot me the instant it did. At a fork, a signpost offered lies in both directions. I chose the one with more potholes and fewer opinions. Half an hour later, I let the bicycle fall gently in a ditch where grass would grow through it before anyone remembered it mattered. The farm lane brought me to a house that had been built by hands that expected to be forgiven. I knocked as a niece, twice removed. An old man opened and looked past my face to the past behind it. "You're late," he said. "I left early," I answered. He led me through a kitchen where onions told the truth, and into a room that remembered winter better than spring. On the table lay a ledger, neat, awful, not names. Supplies, fuel, grain, thread, the scaffolding of survival the occupiers wanted to claim as theirs. He tapped a page with a knuckle. "They take. We count anyway." I nodded and closed the book. "Burn it," I said. "Or better, write the numbers wrong." He smiled, showing a soldier's humor in a farmer's mouth. "I was hoping you'd say that." He gave me a coat that once belonged to a woman who outlived 3 regimes by planting in all of them. In its pocket, a card with a single dot at the top left. Northwest, the kind of direction you can carry in your feet without letting it touch your tongue. By evening, I reached a town that pretended to be asleep at dusk. Shutters blinked. Dogs held counsel. A square kept its secrets under chairs stacked like sleeping cattle. At the inn, the keeper regarded me as a ledger he meant to balance. I paid too much and asked for a room with a window that could be persuaded. He gave me one with a lock that admitted it wasn't invited. On the sill, a fly died with ceremony. Beyond, a courtyard, and beyond that, a wall low enough to argue with. I slept for an hour without dreams and woke to footsteps that had learned my door's sigh. They paused, moved on, came back, decided to be brave tomorrow. At first light, I left by the kitchen, leaving the room cleaner than I found it, and the bed unmade on purpose. People trust a bed that looks recently argued with. The road north of town carried the kind of traffic that minds its own business. Carts, a baker's boy, a woman with a basket of eggs that thought too well of themselves. I walked as if learning the lyrics to a song I might hum later. At a chapel that had lost a bell and kept its faith, I sat on the step and unlaced my boot to free a stone that wasn't there. A priest swept the threshold with the thoroughness of a man who had once done more dangerous things. He hesitated just long enough to place a folded square near my heel. A maplet, free streets, a circle, a time. I arrived early and admired cabbages I had no intention of buying. When the minute struck, a man in a cap that had survived 3 heads lifted one crate and set it down, revealing a cigar box with a hinge that flinched. Inside, a small tin soldier, a spool of thread, and a piece of mirror no bigger than a postage stamp. I took the thread and left the soldier. We all needed different saints. The mirror caught a face I knew, the spectacles from the cleaner room, the mouth that practiced patience as policy. He was 2 stalls away, pretending to admire turnips, pretending not to recognize the woman who had taught his metronome the limits of time. I did not hurry. Hurrying is a confession. I thanked the cabbage seller for her prices, which were fair and wrong, and turned into a lane that had learned to curve for privacy. He did not follow. Perhaps he, too, had been warned not to chase shadows through markets. Perhaps he wanted to believe he had already won and was only tidying up. By noon I was beyond the town and the rumor of it, walking along a ditch where frogs rehearsed for spring. A child waved from a gate and asked if the war was over. For today, I said, it was the best truth I could afford. The border proper arrived the way a fever breaks, suddenly, with sweat and relief and the memory of a different temperature. A post, a hut, a soldier smoking because orders are warmer with smoke. I crossed where the hedge had a gap politely pretending not to be a gap. On the other side, a road led to a village that had decided to be generous with bread that morning. I walked into its generosity and let it cover me like a shawl. In the bakery, the woman behind the counter glanced at my coat, at my boots, at the dirt honest enough to keep. She set a loaf down and said, "You look like someone who needs the end piece." "I do," I said. She cut it and wrapped it with the grace of a nurse dressing a wound. Under the heel, a coil, smaller than before. "Enough. Storm," she said. 2 days, I answered. I left the shop and the village took me in. Chickens negotiated, a horse doubted the necessity of work, a boy practiced a whistle he would someday use for love. I walked through it all as if I had always belonged. And if, somewhere behind me, a file grew thicker with guesses and a line under my name learned to bend, It did not matter. They could write until ink forgot what it was for. I carried no names. I never would. The village let me pass through it the way water passes through cupped hands, held for a moment, then freed. Beyond the last house the road tipped into pines that kept their own counsel. Resin and damp earth, the old smell of countries that existed before borders were invented. I walked until the trees agreed to share their shade. At a bend, a wayside cross leaned like a tired sentinel. Someone had tied a ribbon to it, faded blue, stubborn. I straightened the knot without meaning to. Some habits are older than training. A cart overtook me, the driver singing low to a horse with opinions. He slowed without looking. Long road. Long enough, I said. He flicked the reins in a way that meant climb up if you must. I did, keeping my basket between us like a polite secret. We rode in companionable silence. Fields opened and closed like books that had forgotten their titles. At a crossroads, he halted and pointed with his chin. That way is inspected. This way is ignored. Ignored is kinder, I said. He grunted, pleased to have his map confirmed, and clicked the reins. When we parted, he handed me a knife wrapped in cloth, a peasant's blade, honest and work-worn. For bread, he said. We both knew it was for rope if it came to that. Afternoon thinned into the hour when birds sound like keys on a ring. The track narrowed to a footpath and then to a decision. I chose the ground that sloped toward water. Rivers are diplomats. They negotiate with every stone. At the bank I knelt and washed my hands until the cold convinced my skin it was mine again. In the mirror of the current, I saw what the rooms had not broken. A face that knew how to wait and a mouth that had learned to be a gate. Voices on the far side. Men, tired, discussing soup as if it were strategy. I melted into reed and shadow until their boredom turned them away. When the light lowered its voice, I crossed at the ford where the river kept a memory of shallow. The next village spoke another accent of the same hunger. I bought matches I did not need and salt I would share. In the square, a child drew a circle of stones and stood inside it as if testing a spell. I stepped around, not through. Respect is a language children understand better than soldiers. I slept that night in a shed that had once been a boathouse. Oars stacked like abandoned intentions, tar asleep in a pail. Wind tapped the boards with a rhythm that made me think of keys and of doors answered too late. I let the tapping count me into a sleep without pictures. At dawn, fog wore the river like a shawl. I followed the towpath until a lock-keeper's cottage appeared, square as a jaw. A woman swept the step with the authority of a queen disguised as someone's aunt. She watched me approach, then watched me not approach. Finally she said, "Well, the way people say good morning when they mean decide. I'm headed north." I told the sweep, not her. "Everyone is," she said. She didn't ask my name. She opened the door and let the warmth speak first. Inside, a clock ticked the way honest clocks do, without ambition. She set a bowl on the table, porridge, plain as a fact. "Eat," she said. When I had, she poured a little more and looked at my hands. "You knit." "Only when the needles are empty," I said. She smiled with one corner of her mouth, then reached under the bench and brought up a packet wrapped in brown paper and string. "Boy left this," she said. "Said it was for a woman who walks like she's counting." I waited. Light. Inside, a coil small as a fist, 2 capacitors, a sliver of crystal, and a card with a dot at bottom right. "Southeast. Not north at all. You have a bridge that looks the other way." I asked. "We have a lock gate that sometimes forgets to close," she answered. We understood one another perfectly. She sent me out the back where the towpath became a thought. Across the water, a boy in a cap whistled a tune that missed a note we used to mean safe. I answered with the missing note and crossed on boards that had never been meant for feet like mine. The farm beyond the lock smelled of hay and diesel and a patience that had paid taxes to 3 governments. A man greased a tractor with the reverence of a monk polishing an icon. He nodded at my coat, then at the sky. "Weather," he said. "Tomorrow," I answered. In the barn, we built a voice out of cowardly parts that wanted to be brave. The coil nestled into its cradle. The crystal caught the world and persuaded it to sing. I tuned with 2 fingers and a wrist that remembered stations by feel. We sent a short report. No heroics, no long sentences. Just the shape of the net and where it had tightened, where it had torn, where it would try next. When we finished, we dismantled the thing as if it had been a sin and we were tidy penitents. On the lane, A cart rattled with a deliberate clatter. The driver glanced in, saw a barn that stored hay and nothing else, and moved on, satisfied with the version of the world he preferred. I took the long way out, between hedges that remembered spring and ditches practicing for it. At a stile, an old woman sat with a sack of potatoes and a face that had known everything and judged little. She patted the plank beside her. I Saturday. You look like the sort who doesn't speak when spoken to, she said. I answer when asked the right question. I said. She nodded, pleased to have met an equal in stubbornness. From her pocket, she drew a single brass button, shined by years of worry. She pressed it into my hand. For luck, she said, but don't spend it all at once. I slipped it into my coat where my heart could keep it company. The road bent toward a town that had the look of a place recently visited by uniforms, tidy where it shouldn't be, nervous where it should. I walked as if I had errands that bored me. A dog followed, decided I wasn't interesting, and chose someone else to love. Near the station, a poster screamed certainty. Beneath it, a smaller notice whispered about ration cards. The whisper was the truth. I marked the hours in my head. By evening, the fog returned with reinforcements. I crossed the yard behind the stationer's shop and knocked the knock that says it's me and it's still me. Inside, the woman with the blue coat undid her hair and became simply a woman who was tired and refusing to act like it. We compared maps made of memory and rumor. We moved a route that had gotten too lucky. We closed a door that had started to squeak. We opened nothing we didn't have the hands to hold. When it was time to sleep, she gave me a bed that sagged like a confession. I lay on my side and watched the streetlight draw a square on the wall and erase it, draw and erase. All night, like a child practicing honesty. Just before dawn, a sparrow knocked the sill with its beak twice. I woke smiling despite myself. Even the birds had learned our language. I dressed, tied my shoes, hid the coil where cloth could learn to keep a secret, and stood a moment with my hand on the door. If they took me again, and they might, they always might, I knew what I would carry into the room. Not names. Never names. Only the weather. Only the routes. Only my own. The day moved like a cautious animal, showing itself and then retreating. I stepped into it with the patience of someone who has learned that haste breaks more than it mends. On the high street, shutters yawned open, one by one, like mouths deciding whether to speak. I bought a length of twine and a packet of needles and let the shopkeeper tell me a story about her cousin's hens, as if chickens could keep the world from falling apart. At the edge of town, a procession of schoolchildren crossed the road in pairs, each holding the other's hand like a promise. I waited, head bowed, counting them the way one counts blessings you don't deserve. The last girl looked up and smiled with the ferocity of the living. It steadied me more than bread. I took the lane that pretended to lead nowhere and led it. Hedgerows stitched the fields together with a craftswoman's neatness. A magpie scolded me for reasons it refused to explain. When the lane ended at a gate, I climbed it and dropped into a field where the grass had practiced lying flat. Halfway across, the world changed temperature, the way it does when a cloud decides it is a roof. Voices reached me first, then the shapes that made them. 2 men in coats that fit, a third in a cap too new, a dog whose loyalty was undecided. I kept walking as if the field belonged to errants. The dog trotted over and sat down, the way dogs do when they have judged your soul and found it uninteresting. One of the men whistled. The dog pretended to misunderstand. I bent and scratched its ear with the absent-minded kindness of a woman who has never learned the difference between someone else's dog and her own. When I straightened, my coat had lost a button and gained a folded scrap under the lapel. I did not look at the men. I did not look at the scrap. I walked on until the field gave me back to the lane, and the lane returned me to a bridge that had never decided whether it preferred water or people. Under the arch, out of sight, I read the message, 3 words written like a breath: change the hour. I tore it into seeds and fed it to the river. The mill wore the afternoon like a work apron. Bruno announced me with a bark that could have been a hymn if he'd had lessons. The boy shushed him and failed, then shushed him again and succeeded. Inside, flour dust lifted and settled like a snow that knew when to behave. We moved the plan a single notch. 11 became 10. East became north. The door that used to be a window became a window again. Tiny changes, the kind that seem petty until they save a life. While the young man packed the coil into its new disguise, The woman in the blue coat looked at my hands and then at my face. "You're tired," she said. "I'm practiced," I answered. She shook her head, not in argument, but in respect for accuracy. Dusk arrived as if it had paid for a ticket and meant to sit through the entire performance. I walked out with a basket that held only twine and needles and the certainty that someone, somewhere, was counting on me to be ordinary. At the corner by the shrine, a soldier smoked with the elaborate distaste of a man who had promised to quit. He flicked ash toward the ditch, missed, and watched it glow on the gravel like a tiny, stubborn star. "Long day," he said to no one. "They all are," I answered to the air. I reached the safe room early and let the walls memorize my breathing. At 10 exactly, a knock sounded that knew the rhythm we taught to people we were not prepared to lose. The woman stepped in with a basket of apples that smelled like an argument settled in our favor. We laid out the radio's bones while the clock pretended not to stare. The channel opened quickly tonight, too quickly. I tasted the metallic edge of listening ears. We shortened our weather, clipped our wind, turned our nouns back into vegetables. The young man tapped twice against the table leg, the signal that says foxes are hunting, and I bent the message around their teeth. We signed off with a proverb that wasn't, and then, because the channel still felt too warm, I said a single sentence meant for anyone who knew me well enough to hear it. All gardens require patience. Some require winter. We broke the set, wiped the table, and let the room return to whatever life it would have had without us. On the stairs we met a neighbor with a bucket and the talent of not noticing. We borrowed her talent for the length of the landing and returned it undamaged. Outside, rain had chosen sides. I let it have my shoulders and refused it my bones. Across the street, a silhouette moved behind a curtain, paused, and then withdrew, the way a doubt leaves when it realizes you have already answered it. I slept 2 hours and woke to the certainty that the door was about to learn my name again. I dressed without haste, tied my hair the way tired women do, and took my place at the table with an apple, a knife, and the calm that comes from knowing exactly what you will not do. When the knock came, official and awake, I opened as if they were late for supper. 3 men, the right number for confidence. One with spectacles, one with a cap too new, one with a mouth that had rehearsed cruelty and found it boring. "Papers," the spectacles said. I placed them on the table beside the apple and did not glance at the knife. He read them, then read me, then looked at the room as if it might confess to sheltering more than chairs. "We have questions," he said. "I have bread," I answered. The cap smirked, cruelty yawned. They followed me to the stationer's, to the tailor's, to the baker who had learned to sell nothing with the dignity of a king selling everything. At each stop they discovered a woman shopping for a life that did not include them. Back in the room, Spectacles tried courtesy. "If you would be so good as to accompany us," he said. I slipped into my coat and left the apple on the table with the knife in it, a small, private flag. In the corridor, the careful guard stood where corridors keep their secrets. He did not look at me. He never did. As I passed, ash fell from his cigarette and drew a figure on the floor that only tired people know how to read. A line, a bend, a door. We took the bend. We went through the door. The room on the other side had a bulb that hummed and a chair that remembered me. I sat as if returning to an old job that paid in boredom and bruises. "Name," Spectacles said. I gave it to him, the only one I carry. He waited, polite, for more. I peeled silence like an apple and handed him the skin. We began again, because that is what rooms like this believe in, beginnings without endings. I let him ask. I let the clock pretend it was in charge. I let the rain count the roof. And when the question came, as it always did, wearing all its former faces, who? I gave the same answer that has kept more people alive than any prayer I know. Only my name. The clock in the new room had no hands, only a face that watched us fail to measure each other. They kept the metronome, though, as if time needed a smaller instrument to be believed. The doctor returned with his pulse and his theories. Spectacles returned with his file and his patience. I returned with my chair and the single word I could afford. He tried something almost kind. "You are educated," he said. "You know causes eat their young. Save yourself before yours does." I remembered a boy carrying messages in the lining of his cap, a woman baking courage into loaves, a farmer who hid detonators in grain and grief in his sleeve. "We are poor at cannibalism," I said. "We prefer sharing." He placed a photograph between us, blurry, long lens, two figures at a bridge that every river owns. Is this you? I lifted the picture, studied the shadows, returned it to the table without turning it. It's a bridge, I said. And the other? A shadow, I said. Yours if you like. We went from places to dates, from dates to trains, from trains to the price of kerosene. When he erred, I let him err. When he circled, I let him tire. There is a point in all questioning when the questioner begins to hear his own voice as weather. Inevitable, impersonal, not worth arguing with. A fly declared jurisdiction over the room and failed. The bulb hummed its old hymn of fatigue. Somewhere down the hall, a typewriter decided to be important. I breathed in fours and kept the map behind my eyes folded tight. Only routes, never names. Only doors, never owners. At noon, there was an interruption bureaucracy calls mercy. A clerk entered with a paper in the expression of a man who has learned to live by margins. He murmured to Spectacles. Spectacles frowned with the courtesy of someone whose disappointment is an instrument. Transfer delayed. He said, not to me, not to the doctor, but to the idea of victory. I watched the word delayed sit on the table like a cup no one meant to drink from. Afternoon wore us all down to the wood. Spectacles loosened his tie by a single, careful breath. The doctor turned his clipboard into a shield again. I let my shoulders sag the way a rope does when the bucket finally reaches the well. He tried one last theater. He set the pen in front of me, uncapped, as if it had walked here on its own. You could end this with ink, he said. I traced the pen's shine with my eyes, followed the thin silver of it to the place where a signature would live, and found it empty enough to be beautiful. Ink ends nothing, I said. It only remembers. The guard with the careful shoulders took me back along a corridor that had memorized too many shoes. At the stairwell, he paused to knock ash from his cigarette and missed the tray on purpose. Ash fell into a little line, bent once, and stopped at the corner, a drawing a child might make of escape. I did not look at it. I thanked the air for learning our language. In the cell, the cot had new straw that smelled of a field pretending it's summer. On the wall, the rectangle where the calendar had been was darker, as if time itself had left a stain. I straightened the blanket, then ruined the straightening with my hand so it looked human. Control is a fire that keeps you warm as long as you don't try to cook with it. Night came honest and without favors. I slept because refusing sleep cedes the room to them, and I had nothing left to give. I woke to boots, not many, the tired kind. They opened the door and found me dressed like someone who respects other people's schedules. Back under the bulb, Spectacles had traded patience for procedure. Last time, he said, not a threat, not a promise, just a sentence with no adjectives left. He recited names laced with guesses, the way fishermen say prayers to rivers they do not respect. I let them pass. He slowed, surprised by the ease with which the silence held. Something shifted then, not in the room, but in him. He looked at my face as if trying to remember where he had seen it without a table between us. Perhaps in a market, where women do the arithmetic of hunger. Perhaps in a dream that refused to end obediently. He closed the file and shut his eyes for the length of a single breath. When he opened them, the man who enjoyed the ritual of questions was gone. A tired functionary had taken his place. You will go from here, he said, to a facility where patience is shorter. He stood, as if the statement required him to be taller than conscience. Do you understand? I folded my hands the way a woman folds washing, efficiently, without reverence, because clean or not, people still need shirts. I understand, I said. You don't have my weather. He blinked, offended by poetry. The doctor coughed, offended by the lack of it. They signed the papers that move bodies under the illusion of law. The careful guard escorted me down through the building's throat, past doors that had learned everyone's footsteps. At the last turn, he halted as if he had forgotten a word and needed to fetch it. When he spoke, it was to the wall. The road south floods, he said. Tonight. I said nothing because gratitude makes witnesses of people who mean to remain furniture. He walked on. I followed. Outside, the rain had muscle. The truck waited like an answer nobody liked. I climbed in, sat where women sit who have learned that seats are just another way to be counted, and watched the water carve new maps in the yard. We lurched forward, coughed, consented to move. The driver swore at the sky with the intimacy of old enemies. Fields on either side filled to the brim and then reconsidered their borders. At the low place where the culvert failed, the road became a river with delusions of being a road. The truck stalled. The driver tried persuasion, prayer, profanity. The engine preferred rain. The guards jumped down to argue with water and discovered water does not bargain. One shouted for a rope. Another fetched it. The rope laughed and floated the wrong way. The careful guard leaned into the cab and looked past me to the dark beyond the flap. He did not speak. He only held my gaze long enough to be sure I still understood drawings made of ash. I shifted, not like a hero, not like a thief, but like a woman retrieving a basket. Canvas, air, rain, mud up to the ankle, then the shin. Cold that teaches, hard, efficient. The flood had pulled the ditch into the field and the field into the road. In that little anarchy, I became one more piece of weather. Knees, hands, the old prayer. Not safe, not soon through. I reached the fence by inches and then by the memory of inches. On the far side, trees argued with wind in a language older than borders. I slipped into their grammar and let them conjugate me. Behind, a shout. Ahead, only rain. I did not run. Running draws lines on the world. I let the world erase me kindly, the way water erases chalk. When the ground rose, it did so suddenly, like mercy changing its mind in your favor. I climbed until the road was a sound and the truck a rumor. Under the trees, the storm became a roof. I stood, breath sewing itself back into one continuous thread, and laughed once because I was alive and had no one to scold me for it. I walked until the rain forgot my name and the night remembered it kindly. At the edge of a farmyard, a lantern moved once and then settled. I knocked like a niece again. A woman opened with flour on her hands and the look of someone who had always intended to be useful. "No names," she said. "Only the weather," I answered. She let me in. She set a towel by the stove and a bowl on the table and a chair exactly where a chair ought to go, while my clothes remembered warmth. We spoke of eggs and gutters and the way roofs betray you when you need them most. Under such conversation, the world holds. When I lay down in the loft, the rain played the roof like an old instrument. I closed my eyes and let it count me through the night. And if a room with a bulb waited somewhere ahead, patient as stone, it could wait. I had my answer ready in every pocket of my breath. Only my name. Dawn found the farmyard rinsed clean, puddles holding small skies. I moved through the morning like a guest who meant to be forgotten, washing the bowl, stacking wood, mending a tear in my coat with stitches so small they looked like patience made visible. The woman washed without watching, the way people do when they've decided trust is work they're willing to do again today. By mid-morning, I was on the lane with a basket that had earned its keep. A boy cycled past, hat too big, elbows like wings. He wobbled, steadied, and, without slowing, held out a letter gripped between two fingers. No address, just a pencil line at the corner like the horizon in a child's drawing. I tucked it into my sleeve and let the wheel squeak fade. In the next village, a clock that ran 5 minutes late presided over a square that preferred gossip to commerce. I bought salt and left change I didn't know. Overpaying is diplomacy, an agreement signed in small coins. At the pump, an old man argued with the handle. I took his place for 2 strokes, and the water remembered its job. He nodded at my hands. "Strong," he said. "Borrowed," I said, and we both accepted the truth of that. I read the letter in the shelter of a cart shed that smelled of rope and dry rain. 4 short lines, 1 longer space where a name would have been if we were the sort of people who could afford them. A rendezvous folded into an errand, the kind of instruction that becomes harmless if held up to the wrong light. I walked the long way on purpose. Across a meadow, through a stand of willows rehearsing spring, past a laundry line where each shirt had learned to face the wind alone. At the lane's end, the house I needed presented itself as ordinary. Gate squeak, garden neat, a chicken with the self-esteem of a mayor. I knocked like a woman who has brought eggs and an apology. A girl opened, face grave with the responsibility of being 11. She took the basket, weighed it as if counting more than shells, and set it on a chair. Her eyes flicked left, corridor, curtain, room. Inside, the woman with the blue coat sat with her hair braided into certainty. The young man sorted wires that pretended to be nothing. On the table, a pair of boots rested heel to heel like soldiers off duty. "We send at dusk," she said. "Dawn will listen better," I answered. She tilted her head, considered the weather inside and out, and nodded. Dawn then. We spent the afternoon as if the world were harmless, peeling potatoes, unpicking a hem, teaching the girl to read the map of a street by its sounds. At one point the young man looked up from his wires and asked, not meaning to, "When does it end?" "When people forget to ask that," I said. He smiled without liking the answer. Near evening a trader called at the gate with onions and the news disguised as prices. Truck on the northern road. New faces in the old boots. A doctor who enjoyed his work less than yesterday. We ate in the kitchen with the window curtains half drawn. The girl told a joke so serious it cured us all for a minute. Afterward we did dishes in an order that would be easy to describe to anyone who ever needed to swear we were only people with plates. Night walked the lane on soft feet. We waited for it to settle before we built the voice. The coil sat in its cradle like a heart that had decided to be brave one more time. I tuned by breath and bone. The channel opened the way doors open when someone on the other side wants you to succeed. We sent what mattered and refused to send more. Bridges that should be avoided by anyone who intended to live. Trains that would arrive with more uniforms than passengers. A list of markets where the price of flour told a different story each day. At the edge of the last line, I added 3 words I had not planned to send. Winter requires patience. To someone listening, those words would mean change routes, change clocks, change faces. To anyone else, it would sound like the complaint of a woman with cold hands. We broke the set, swallowed the room back into its ordinary life, and let silence have the table. The girl yawned like a cannon firing a pillow. The woman touched my wrist once. The young man looked at the floor and straightened a knot that did not need straightening. I slept an hour in a chair that wanted to be kinder than it was. When I woke, the house had the stillness of a place that knows it is being considered by hostile mathematics. I laced my boots, tied my hair, and kissed the girl's forehead in the old, practical way that blesses without making a fuss. On the road, Frost argued with the ruts. The moon leaned out to see how we were doing and decided to mind its business. Halfway to the crossroads, I stepped off the lane to avoid a conversation with a pair of boots that had never served anyone but themselves. They passed, content with the version of the world they had been handed. At the shrine, the ribbon had loosened again. I left it alone. Some knots you respect by not touching. By noon, the day had learned to behave. Clouds filed in an orderly line, wind obedient, barns minding their hay. I crossed a field that belonged to cows and, for a moment, to me. On the far side, a stone wall looked the other way while I borrowed its top. From there, I saw the valley and the road thinning toward the idea of a border. Somewhere beyond that, a town I would enter and leave unremarked. I climbed down and walked on, coat buttoned, mouth closed, palms ready to offer or deny as needed. The brass button the old woman had given me clicked once against a thread in my pocket, small as a metronome that obeyed no one. By evening I had a room no one would remember and a breath I had earned. I lit no lamp. I folded the day into the coat and slept with the certainty that, if morning brought a knock and a chair and a bulb, I knew how to make the room larger than its walls. If they asked, if they went from bridges to trains to weather to names the way they always do, I would give the answer I have given in every dialect of fear, only my name.